The rain had been falling since dawn, a slow, sullen drizzle that blurred the lamps along the Quai des Orfèvres into trembling halos of light. In the grey reflection of the Seine, barges passed like silent ghosts, their lanterns faint and far apart. Inside his office, Maigret sat motionless, pipe unlit, staring through the misted window toward the Pont Saint-Michel. Somewhere beyond that bridge, beyond the dripping rooftops and the rattle of trams, a girl had disappeared. She had no record, no trace, no one to name her properly. Only a letter, half-soaked, half-burned, had been found on a café table in Montparnasse. It bore no signature, only the words, "She walked into the rain and never came back." The inspectors downstairs were saying it was nothing. Girls vanished every week in Paris, runaways, dreamers, ghosts of the night. But Maigret felt something different in this one, something that clung to the fog and to the uneasy quiet of the streets. Perhaps it was the timing, or the tone of the note, or the face of the man who brought it to him, a face that had already seen too much. The city was heavy with secrets that morning, and even the pigeons seemed to keep their wings close to their sides. If you've ever been drawn to the strange calm before truth surfaces, to the soft hum of Paris under the rain, stay close. There are stories that unfold slowly, like smoke curling above a cafe stove, and this is one of them. As we follow Maigret into alleys, attics, and whispers carried by the Seine, make sure you're part of the journey. Subscribe to keep walking beside him through every case, every shadow, every silent confession. The cafe was half empty when Maigret arrived, its windows filmed with condensation, the air dense with the smell of damp wool and cheap tobacco. Outside, the morning drizzle blurred the street into a watercolor of umbrellas and shining cobblestones. The sign above the awning read, Le Berigny, a place neither elegant nor sordid, simply one of those small establishments that survive on habit and proximity to the station. Inside, the waitress, a thin woman with nervous eyes, was wiping the counter with a cloth that had long since lost its purpose. She looked up as Maigret entered, and recognition flickered. Even here, among people who pretended not to care, everyone knew the inspector of the Quai des Orfèvres by sight. He removed his hat, tapped it lightly against his knee to shake off the rain, and glanced around before choosing a corner table by the window. The light was dim there, tinted green by the canopy outside. The coffee on the table had been there since dawn, now cold and thin, its surface coated with a delicate skin. Beside it lay the letter. It was folded in half, but the edges were curled, the ink blotched where the water had touched it. Maigret leaned closer, pipe still unlit, and studied the careful handwriting. Feminine, small, the strokes decisive. She left it there, the waitress said, quietly, drying her hands on her apron. Didn't pay, didn't say a word, just sat by the window all night. When I came to clear the table this morning, it was still there. Maigret nodded. And you didn't see where she went? She stepped outside when the rain began, didn't even open her umbrella. I thought she'd wait under the awning, but she just kept walking toward the boulevard. The woman hesitated, then added, she looked, how to say, like someone who had decided something, not lost, not afraid, just finished. The inspector turned the letter over in his fingers, feeling the stiffness of paper dried by heat after being soaked by rain. It had been opened already by one of the local constables who thought it might concern a suicide. But there was no address, no salutation, no name. Only a few sentences written in a hand too controlled for despair. She walked into the rain and never came back. Do not look for me, you would not understand. Maigret read it twice, 3 times. each time feeling the weight of what wasn't written. There was no plea for forgiveness, no mention of who you might be, and no attempt to explain. The tone was deliberate, almost serene. Whoever had written it had meant every word. He folded it carefully, returned it to the envelope, and slid it into his coat pocket. "No one asked after her?" The waitress shook her head. "She didn't speak to anyone. Just watched the rain. I brought her coffee at midnight. She barely touched it. When I came back later, she was gone." "What time?" "Close to 2. Anyone else here?" "Only a driver who comes every night. He fell asleep by the stove. And a man from the post office. He left just before she did." Maigret wrote their names in his notebook, though he knew, from long habit, that witnesses in places like this rarely remembered what mattered. Still he asked for the cup, the saucer, even the spoon. He handled them as though they were fragile, almost reverently, as if the girl's fingerprints might still cling to them. When he rose to leave, the waitress stopped him with a hesitant gesture. "Inspector, do you think something bad happened to her?" He paused at the door, looking out into the mist where the tram lines vanished. "Something happened," he said quietly. "But whether it was bad, we'll see." Outside, the rain had strengthened into a fine, relentless curtain. The sound of water against the pavement was steady, hypnotic. Maigret turned up his collar and began to walk toward the boulevard, retracing the girl's path. He imagined her small figure, coat unbuttoned, hair clinging to her neck as she crossed the empty street. No one had stopped her, no one had followed. Paris was too vast for anyone to notice a single person dissolving into its rain. At the corner, he found the entrance to a narrow alley between 2 buildings. It smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. There, a lamplighter was finishing, his round, the flame flickering in the wind. Maigret paused to light his pipe, shielding it with his hand. The first puff brought the familiar bitterness, the warmth that steadied his thoughts. He thought of the letter again. Its brevity reminded him of other notes, other cases, women who left husbands, lovers, debts, children. Yet something about this one resisted explanation. It wasn't written by someone fleeing shame or sorrow. It had the tone of someone who had completed a task. He walked until he reached the Seine. The river was swollen, sluggish, the surface broken by circles of rain. A barge creaked against its moorings. Somewhere downstream, a horn sounded, a long, mournful note that seemed to drift across the water and vanish into the fog. A gendarme in a slick black coat stood near the parapet, smoking under an umbrella. He nodded respectfully. "Inspector, you heard about the girl?" "I did." "They dragged the river at dawn, just in case." "Nothing." Maigret didn't answer. He watched the water slide under the bridge, carrying leaves and scraps of paper. "Who ordered the drag?" "Local station chief, routine procedure." "Good." He hesitated. "If anything turns up, send word to the quay. Ask for me directly." The man nodded, and Maigret continued along the quay, boots splashing through puddles. His mind was already sorting the fragments: a girl with no name, a letter with no address, a disappearance with no witness. He would start, as always, with the simplest things: the cup, the paper, the handwriting, the traces of ink. Somewhere in those small details lay the pulse of truth. At the corner of Rue des Écoles, a café door opened, and a gust of warm air met him. He stepped inside, shook off his coat, and sat near the stove. The warmth seeped slowly through his damp clothes. He ordered nothing, only sat, pipe between his fingers, eyes half closed. He wasn't thinking in words anymore, but in sensations: the rhythm of footsteps, the tone of the waitress's voice, the way the rain had softened the letters on the page. He stayed like that for almost an hour until the streets grew lighter and the cafe began to fill. When he finally rose, he had made up his mind. Tomorrow he would send Janvier to trace the letter's paper, and ink, Lucas, to question the postal workers, and he himself would visit the boarding houses near Montparnasse. The girl had walked into the rain and never returned, yes, but somewhere someone had watched her go and someone else had waited for her not to. By midday the fog had begun to lift. The wet stones of the quay glistened like black glass. As Maigret crossed the bridge back toward the office, he paused once more to look down at the water. It was the same river that had mirrored every tragedy and every tenderness of Paris. He took a slow breath, then exhaled smoke into the pale air. Somewhere in the city, he thought, the truth was still breathing, quietly, like a secret that didn't yet know it would be found. And as he walked on, the letter in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as though the paper itself carried not just words, but a weight waiting to be named. By the time Maigret reached the streets that fed the Gare de Lyon, the rain had eased into a weary mist that clung to the collars of passers-by and silvered the horsehair of broom bristles as a street sweeper moved the water along. Steam rose from the grates beside the station, and the great clock loomed pale against a sky the colour of zinc. He did not hurry. The station had its own tempo, an old one, the slow suck of the locomotive's breath, the rhythmic clatter from some hidden workshop, the murmur of voices that always sounded as if they were discussing departures rather than meetings. Close by, in a side street where trunk sellers kept their shutters half-closed, and the smell of coal dust lay in the seams of the stones, the boarding houses began. He chose the third on the right because the curtains were clean and the brass number had been polished. A narrow door opened onto a vestibule with a hat stand and a calendar from a provincial liqueur company. A bell rang somewhere in the interior as he stepped in, and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on a towel that had once been white. She had a thin mouth but lively eyes, and when she recognized him, those eyes softened with a mixture of relief and calculation. "Inspector," she said, "what a day to be out." "All days are the same when one works," he answered mildly, setting his hat on the stand and shaking a few drops from his coat. "Madame?" "Bravo," she said. "I keep rooms here for respectable people, mostly railway men on short assignments, clerks from the post, quiet folk." "Quiet folk who pay on time," Maigret said, as if quoting her thought. He smiled faintly. "I'm looking for a girl, young, hair perhaps dark when wet, lighter when brushed, a small face. She may have come in with a modest bag and asked for a room without windows giving onto the street." Madame Raveau's hand tightened on the towel. It was almost imperceptible, but enough. Maigret said nothing. He watched the way her eyes shifted toward the staircase and then back to him, as if the banister itself might contradict her. "There was a young woman," she said at last. "Just for a night or two. Very polite. Paid in advance. She said she was waiting for a friend." "And her name?" The woman hesitated, then seemed to find courage in the towel, twisting it once. "Mademoiselle Vera Lemoine." Maigret did not write it down at once. He let the name drift through him, listening to its weight. Too neat, too easily formed. A name chosen the way one selects a scarf in a shop. Not the best, not the worst, merely one that would not draw attention. "You recorded it?" he said. "Of course, I keep my register, as the law requires." She led him through a narrow corridor, smelling of boiled cabbage and coal, and into a small office where a table stood beneath a gas bracket. The book on the table was clean. The lines were straight, the ink regular. Madame Raveau opened it to a page and pointed. There it was, the slanted hand, Vera Lemoine, entered 2 nights previously, with the number of a room and the mention of 1 trunk. The address given was a vague one in Dijon, a street without a number, the kind of address that exists only on the tip of a tongue. "Did she speak of Dijon?" Maigret asked, taking his pipe from his pocket and turning it over in his fingers without lighting it. "She did not speak," the landlady said. When she did, it was to ask for hot water and to have the window closed. She had the look of someone who listens for footsteps that do not come. What did she leave behind? Madame Raveau's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Nothing. Girls leave combs, bits of ribbon. She left nothing, except... She turned to a small drawer and produced a scarf, folded carefully. This. It fell behind the chair when I cleaned. It smells of... how do you say? Of a soap from a good shop. Maigret held the scarf to his face, breathing through it as one breathes through a memory. There was something faintly floral and faintly medicinal in it, the mixture people from the provinces brought back from big city counters. He gave it back to the landlady. "The room," he said. On the 2nd floor, the corridor bent like an elbow. A single window looked onto a narrow shaft where the sky was a strip of white. Madame Raveau unlocked a door with a key that chirped as it turned. The room was small, clean in the way of places that have been recently vacated. The bed was made with a precision that did not quite erase the shape of a body that had slept there. A washstand stood beneath a mirror crazed with lines like frost. On the mantel was a matchbox from a café near the station. The top had been struck and closed again, leaving a smudge on the finger that had done it. On the floor beside the bed, barely visible in the seam of the boards, a corner of paper protruded. "May I?" Maigret asked, though the tone was not really a question. He drew a penknife from his pocket and worked the edge of the board up just far enough to pinch the paper free. It was the torn half of a telegram, blank, the kind one fills in at the counter without sending to see if the words fit. Only 3 letters remained, faint but legible. Dig. He placed it on the washstand and weighed it with the soap dish as if it might otherwise take flight. "Who else saw her?" he asked. "The other tenants," Madame Raveau said, but she looked uneasy. "They are discreet. One does not question people when they are in transit." "You questioned them," Maigret said gently. "You are a good keeper of rooms because you know when to ask and when to keep tea hot in the evenings." She almost smiled this time, almost. "There is Monsieur Pommier from the postal."
"Wagons, a decent man with tired eyes, and young Armand, my son, but he has work in the mornings and comes home late. He sleeps in the attic and does not mix. There is also a commercial traveller with a grey valise who stays when his routes bring him to Paris. He left before dawn." "How long had the girl been here?" "2 nights, she said. The first, she returned before the last tram. The second, I did not hear her come in." Her voice thinned as she spoke, and again her eyes went to the banister as if it had kept a secret from her. "Inspector, if something has happened?" "Something always has," Maigret said. "It's the shape of it that matters." He dismissed Madame Raveau and stood a long time alone in the room. He ran a finger along the sill and felt the fine grit of coal dust. He breathed the flat odour of sheets dried too quickly near a stove. He leaned close to the mirror and then away, seeing how her face blurred and reformed in its cracked veins. On the back of the chair, someone, she or someone before her, had scraped a thumbnail. The wood was pale at the scar. He lit his pipe finally, drawing the smoke in with a steadiness that brought his thoughts into their quiet order. The name, Vera Lemoine, settled in him without settling the matter. It had the weight of invention, like a dress bought to look like any other dress. If there was a true name, it was folded away somewhere, perhaps in a trunk whose brass corners were dull with travel. He tapped ash into the saucer and looked again at the telegram scrap. Dijon. It was not much, but then neither was a thread when one began to pull it. Downstairs, Monsieur Pommier turned out to be a narrow man in a shiny collar, with the kind of patience one acquires from listening to wheels in tunnels. He answered without fuss. He had seen the girl on the stair the first evening, carrying a small bag whose leather had cracked at the corners. She had not looked at him, which was how he knew she noticed him. People who truly look do not avert their eyes with such care. No, he did not know her. No, he had not followed. He had once had a daughter, but that was not a part of this. He said it as one sets a cup carefully on a saucer and steps away. As for the commercial traveller, his name was recorded as Borel, with an address in Troyes that could have belonged to anyone. He had paid in notes and left before daybreak. Madame Raveau produced a cigarette stub he had crushed in the ashtray, as if a man's manner of putting out a cigarette could tell a story. Maigret looked at it and saw only a stub. "And your son?" he asked. "Armand works nights at the station cafe," she said too quickly. "He serves the men who take the late trains. He sleeps in the mornings. He keeps to himself." "I should like to meet him," Maigret said. "Today he is not here," she answered, finding courage again in the towel. "He won't be back until tomorrow, perhaps the next day." The cafe
sometimes keeps him for longer when the timetable changes. Maigret accepted the lie as one accepts a draft that comes under a door. It exists. One notes it. One does not pretend it is a summer breeze. He asked for the address of the cafe and wrote it down. He took the register's page number, not the name, and he pocketed the telegram scrap with the kind of indifference that alerts only the careful. When he stepped back into the street, the mist had turned the lamps into dabs of pale gold. The station breathed again somewhere behind the walls, and a whistle skated along the wet tiles like a knife laid flat. On the corner, a boy in a cap sold newspapers whose ink bled faintly at the edges, and the headlines concerned a minister, a strike, the price of coal. No one had printed a word about a girl who used the rain as a door. He walked toward the station cafe to get the lay of it, the feeling of the counters, the sheen of the tabletops, the kind of men who hunched over bowls with their coats still on. The cafe was not full, not empty. It had the smell of boiled meat and tired coffee. Behind the counter, a young man with a narrow back moved quickly and without grace, as if speed could be a kind of elegance. Armand? Perhaps. The boy did not turn enough for Maigret to be certain. There was no hurry. He would return when the boy's shift ended, when haste had drained from him, and truth could be coaxed out by warmth. On his way out, a woman brushed past him at the door, bringing with her the smell of damp wool and violets. She could have been anyone at all, a seamstress, a traveller, a wife waiting for a train to be late. For an instant he felt the sensation he trusted most, a faint misalignment between what the eyes saw and what the skin understood. It had the delicacy of a draught and the insistence of a memory. He stood under the awning and let the feeling pass through him. Across the street, someone paused beneath the archway of a luggage shop and lifted a match to a cigarette. The face remained in shadow. The flame glowed, went out, glowed again, as if the smoker were measuring the inspector's patience or his habits. Maigret did not alter his pace. The street would remember if he hurried. He returned to the boarding-house once more for the scarf. Madame Raveau gave it up without protest, as if relieved to be rid of the thing. He folded it into his pocket with a care that made it vanish. At the door, he turned and let his eyes move across the vestibule. The hat stand with 2 pegs empty, the calendar with last month's page still beneath the current one, the line of damp along the baseboard where the mop had passed. He thanked the landlady in a tone that made the thanks into a promise or a warning, depending on who heard it. On the quay, the Seine had changed colour, taking on the green of a bottle held to light. The rain had thinned to the smallest imaginable drops, more suggestion than weather. He lit his pipe again and felt the smoke thick and dry at the back of his throat. Vera Lemoine. The name made a pale ring in his mind that would not hold. Dijon, a scarf that smelled of a better shop, a register too clean, a son who was always elsewhere, a commercial traveller whose valise had the precise weight of convenience. It was nothing. It was enough. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were already burning. He would send Janvier to the station café to wait for the moment when a night shift boy became only a boy, and Lucas to the telegraph office to ask after blanks requested and not used. He himself would look at the old files whose dust had the taste of forgotten afternoons. Somewhere in them was a face from a photograph, not yet named, that this case would summon. He did not know why he was sure, only that certainty lay in him like a stone warmed by a pocket. He stopped on the Pont d'Austerlitz and watched a barge move under him, its pilot hunched like a question mark at the stern. The wake spread, touched the embankment, and died. The city was full of such ripples, most too small to see, unless one leaned over the rail and waited. He waited. When the water had smoothed itself back into anonymity, he lifted his head and started toward the office, where the clock and the silence would help him think. Behind him, perhaps, a match flared a second time beneath an archway. The light was small, like a name written in fog. He did not turn. The river took the moment and filed it where rivers keep their secrets, under the rain and behind the lamps. The telegram reached the Quai des Orfèvres the next morning, folded twice and sealed in a grey envelope with the smudge of a provincial postmark. Maigret had been staring at the window pane, where the mist formed slow trails like handwriting trying to form words. Lucas brought the envelope in without a word, placing it on the blotter with a knowing look. "From Dijon," he said simply. The inspector opened it carefully. Inside, a short message, formal, typed, announced that a man named Auguste Villon, clerk at the railway bureau, wished to speak regarding a missing young woman possibly known as Vera Lemoine. He had arrived by train that morning and was waiting in the lobby. "Send him in," Maigret said. When Villon entered, the first impression was of a man who had shrunk inside his own clothes. His coat was serviceable but too large. His hat looked as if it had belonged to another head entirely. The damp had curled the ends of his moustache, and his hands kept wandering toward the brim of his hat, as though uncertain what to do without it. "Sit down," Maigret said, gesturing toward the chair across the desk. "You've come a long way." "Yes, Inspector. I wasn't sure if I should, but when I read the notice in the papers about a girl found missing, and the name Vera, well, I thought perhaps—" He trailed off, eyes moving nervously around the room, taking in the pipe rack, the coat stand, the slow curl of smoke from Maigret's ashtray. "It may be her." "You knew her?" He hesitated. "Not well, only from the station. She travelled often between Dijon and Paris. Always the same train, the 7:05. We'd exchange a few words when she collected her ticket. At first it was nothing, just politeness, but after some time she began to speak of Paris, of the people she met there. She said she came for work, sometimes to visit a friend. I never asked much more. One learns not to pry into the affairs of travellers. What sort of work? She said it was at a dressmaker's on the Rue de la Boétie. But she always seemed not part of that world. Too quiet, too inward. You understand? Maigret nodded. He did understand. There was a kind of quiet one carried like luggage, too heavy to set down, too personal to name. Did she ever mention her family? Villon shook his head. No, only once. She said she was tired of being looked at as though she owed someone an explanation for existing. I remember that phrase. And you never saw her outside the station? A flush rose on the man's cheeks. Once, he said. By chance, I was in Paris on business and stopped at a café near Montparnasse, Le Berigny. She was there, sitting by the window, watching the rain. I thought of speaking to her, but something in her face stopped me. It was not sadness exactly, more like someone listening to a voice only she could hear. Maigret's eyes narrowed. What day was this? Last Thursday, late evening. The same night, he thought, the same café. Villon's hands twisted together on his knees. I left without saying a word. It seemed wrong to intrude. But when I returned to Dijon the next day, she wasn't on the train. That was the first time in months she'd missed it. Then this morning, I saw the notice. So I came. He fell silent. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping the window like fingertips on glass. Maigret regarded him quietly. The man's sincerity was not in question. He had the honest weariness of clerks and railwaymen, the kind of people who measure truth in timetables. Do you believe she harmed herself? Maigret asked. Villon's eyes lifted, startled. No, he said after a moment. No, she wasn't that kind. If she vanished, it was because she had to, not because she wanted to. Because she had to, Maigret repeated softly. Villon nodded. I think so. Once when she was buying a ticket, a man came into the station. She saw him before he saw her, and I'll never forget her face. She went white, as if the world had tilted. She turned away, handed me her money and whispered, Please, make it quick. After that, she avoided the station for 2 weeks. When she returned, she seemed calmer, but never the same. Maigret leaned forward. Describe the man. He was tall, elegant, perhaps 40, a grey felt hat, gloves, a folded newspaper in one hand. Not the sort who travels by second-class carriage. There was something official about him, his posture, the way people stepped aside as he passed. Maigret's mind sifted through a long list of such men. Would you recognize him again? Yes, Inspector, I believe I would. Did she ever speak his name? No, but once she mentioned someone called André. It might have been him, or not. She said it by accident, I think. Her expression afterward. She wished she hadn't. Maigret took a slow draw from his pipe. And you, Monsieur Villon, what did you feel for this girl? The man's gaze faltered. Pity, perhaps. Affection, too. But nothing improper, I swear it. I'm married. My wife knows of her. I told her often that the young woman reminded me of our daughter, who died young. There was no deceit in his tone, only a weary grief that had become part of his breathing. Maigret believed him. He had met such men before, those who sought redemption through the small kindness of listening. He rose and extended his hand. You've done well to come. We may need you again. For now, stay in Paris. The Hôtel de l'Aigle across the river is quiet and cheap. Leave your address with Lucas. Villon hesitated at the door. Inspector, if she's alive, will you tell her I came? Maigret considered the question. If she's alive, she'll know. When the man had gone, Maigret stood a long while at the window, watching the ripples widen in the puddles below. The girl had crossed paths with this gentle clerk and with a man of influence who frightened her. Between the two stretched the shadow of something unspoken, an arrangement perhaps, or a secret too dangerous to reveal. He returned to his desk, spread out the letter from the café beside the scrap of telegram, and drew slow rings of smoke around them as if trying to encircle the truth. The handwriting, the pause in the phrasing, the absence of plea, all of it pointed to one thing: deliberation. She hadn't fled in panic. She had stepped out of sight according to plan. By evening, Janvier brought news from the station café. The boy Armand had not appeared for work that day. His absence was the kind that meant more than illness. Someone had collected his wages early that morning and vanished. "Find out who," Maigret said. "Already done," Janvier replied. "The signature was in his mother's hand." Maigret tamped the ashes in his pipe. The fog outside had thickened again, softening the lamps into globes of yellow light. Somewhere, perhaps in Dijon, perhaps still in Paris, a woman named Vera, or whatever her name truly was, had walked into the rain and found not disappearance, but silence. And someone else, someone older and more practiced in the art of erasure, had helped her to vanish. He would find that silence and listen until it spoke. By the third morning, Paris seemed carved entirely out of water. The fog lay like wet wool over the bridges, the pavements glistened like black mirrors, and the lamps flickered in the wind with the trembling patience of old men. From the Quai des Orfèvres to the boulevard Saint-Michel, the rain came and went, but never truly ceased. It only changed its manner, sometimes whispering, sometimes drumming, sometimes breathing so softly it felt like memory. Maigret stood at his office window and watched a barge push through the mist. The faint chug of its engine sounded like a heartbeat beneath the city. He had slept little. The faces of those he had met, the waitress, Madame Ravotte, the boy Armand who had vanished, and the sad clerk from Dijon, wove through his thoughts like figures seen through smoke. He couldn't yet tell which belonged to truth and which to illusion. Lucas entered quietly, carrying a folder wrapped in brown paper. "The ink analysis from the letter," he said. "It's not from a cheap bottle, imported, German." "Which means someone who buys from shops on the right bank," Maigret murmured. "Not a seamstress or a waitress." "There's more. The scarf, the perfume on it was identified. Fleur de Paris, exclusive to a perfumery on Rue Royale. Pricey." Maigret turned from the window. "So our provincial girl used a perfume that costs a week's wages, wrote her letter with fine ink, and stayed in a boarding house for 3 francs a night. She was either pretending to be poor or pretending to be someone else entirely." Lucas nodded but said nothing. He knew better than to fill the spaces Maigret left open. The inspector's silence was not emptiness, but the pause before a lock turned. "Where's Janvier?" "At the telegraph office. He's tracing unsent telegram forms. There was a batch taken from the Dijon counter 2 weeks ago." "Good." Maigret pulled on his coat. "Tell him I'll be near the river. The girl's path still lies there." The sky had turned the colour of pewter by the time he reached the Quai de la Tournelle. The rain softened everything, the sounds of wheels on cobblestones, the shouts of vendors, even the sharpness of thought. It was a Paris Maigret understood intimately, the city as it existed in the pauses between crimes, grey, patient, indifferent. He walked slowly, stopping at the café near the bridge where the water lapped high against the quay. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the faint sweetness of old wine. A few dockhands sat hunched over their glasses, talking in low tones. Maigret nodded to the barman, ordered coffee, and took a seat facing the door. From here he could see the river through the window, a shifting mirror of silver and grey. Somewhere beyond that greyness he imagined the girl's reflection disappearing, swallowed by the rain. He tried to picture her, small, slight, moving quietly through the crowd, her footsteps soundless on the wet stones. He could almost see her standing by the parapet, the scarf drawn close around her throat, her eyes fixed not on the water, but on the line where the mist met the surface. "She came here often," the barman said suddenly. Maigret's gaze lifted. "Who did?" "The girl you're asking about, the one from the photograph in the papers. Sometimes she'd sit by the window with a notebook. Didn't drink, just coffee or water. Always left before the rain stopped." "When was the last time you saw her?" "Last week. The night before they found that letter. She was with a man, well-dressed, grey hat, gloves, the sort who speaks softly, but expects to be obeyed. They argued, not loudly, but you could feel it." "Did you hear what they said?" The barman hesitated. "Only fragments. He said something about not here, and she said, 'I'm not afraid of you anymore.' After that, they left together." "Which way?" "Toward the Pont de Sully." Maigret left money on the counter and stepped back into the street. The rain had begun again, heavier now, but he didn't raise his collar. He walked slowly, tracing the imagined route, the girl walking quickly, the man keeping a careful pace beside her, both trying to appear invisible. The Pont de Sully loomed ahead, its railings slick, the lamps along its curve glowing like dull embers. He paused in the middle, looking down at the water. A barge was passing beneath, its pilot hunched against the wind. The surface churned and settled again. Something in the movement, an eddy near the pillar, caught his eye. He crouched and watched. A pale scrap of cloth rose briefly before being carried away. A scarf, perhaps, or only a trick of light. But Maigret stayed watching long after it had vanished, his pipe clamped between his teeth, his face unreadable. By late afternoon he was back at the station café where Armand had worked. The place was noisy, crowded with travellers shaking rain from their coats. He took a seat at the counter. The waitress, a sturdy girl with a pale face, poured his coffee without being asked. "You knew Armand Ravot?" he said. "Of course. He worked here till 2 nights ago. Didn't even say goodbye." "Did he have friends?" "Only one I know, a woman who came sometimes. Pretty, quiet, older than him. They'd talk in the corner near the clock. She always paid. He looked frightened of her." "Frightened?" she shrugged. "Not the kind of fear that makes you run, the kind that makes you wait." Maigret stirred his coffee slowly. "Did you hear her name?" "No, but once the cashier called her Madame Delpierre. She didn't correct him." "Describe her?" "Dark hair, expensive coat, gloves. She smelled nice, like violets." The inspector felt something tighten inside him. The perfume again. Fleur de Paris, Rue Royale. He left the café and walked the wet pavements until the lamps came on. The rain glimmered beneath their light like threads of glass. Somewhere, behind one of the tall facades, a woman named Delpierre, perhaps real, perhaps not, was tidying her gloves, erasing her presence from the day. And somewhere else, a missing boy was learning how quickly a favor could turn into silence. When Maigret reached home, it was nearly midnight. Madame Maigret had left the lamp burning low and a pot of stew warming on the stove. She looked up from her sewing when he entered, her eyes calm, accepting. "You've been walking in the rain again," she said, rising to fetch him a towel. He smiled faintly. "It's where people disappear." She said nothing more as he ate, only moved about quietly, tidying things that were already in order, When he finally spoke again, it was not as an inspector, but as a man thinking aloud. "She wasn't poor," he said. "Not really. Everything about her was chosen. The clothes, the perfume, even the handwriting. Someone taught her how to pass among people without belonging to them." "Then perhaps she was being protected," Madame Maigret said softly, "or hidden." He looked at her. "Hidden from what?" "Not from what. From whom?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, and whoever that person is, they're still close. The kind of people who use rain the way others use smoke, to cover their exits." She poured him wine, the gesture simple and grounding. "You'll find her," she said. "I don't know if I'm looking for her," he admitted. "Sometimes I think I'm only looking for the truth she carried." Outside, the rain deepened again, filling the night with its steady rhythm. Maigret sat long after the fire had dwindled, his pipe gone cold, the faint scent of tobacco mingling with the rain that seeped through the window frame. He felt the strange calm that comes when a case has not yet revealed its face but has already taken hold of one's soul. Somewhere out there, between the bridges and the alleys, the girl had left something unfinished, a truth floating just beneath the surface of the Seine, waiting for the current to bring it ashore. And in that thought Maigret found his resolve. Tomorrow he would trace the name Delpierre. But tonight he let the sound of rain fill the silence, steady and endless, like a confession no one had yet dared to speak. By morning the rain had retreated to a fine mist that hung between the chimneys like smoke reluctant to vanish. The air smelled of damp slate and yesterday's coal fires. Paris awoke slowly, as though uncertain the night had truly ended. From their apartment on boulevard Richelieu, Madame Maigret could see the thin stream of water still dripping from the awning across the street, its rhythm steady as a metronome. She had risen early, as she always did, drawn by the quiet. The table was already set for two, the teapot warming on its small iron stand, a loaf of bread wrapped in linen. When Maigret emerged from the bedroom, heavy-footed but composed, she poured his tea before he asked. Her husband always drank it too hot, too quickly, as if it could wake the thoughts he had left somewhere in the fog outside. He sat heavily, grumbling something about the damp. His hat and coat hung by the door, still glistening faintly from his early walk to fetch the morning paper. He didn't open it. Instead, he stared at the rising steam from his cup as though it carried messages from the night. "You've been thinking again?" she said softly, buttering his bread. "I try not to," he murmured. "It interferes with understanding." Madame Maigret smiled faintly. It was an old line, one he repeated whenever he found himself wrestling with a case too fragile to touch directly. She knew better than to press for details, yet her silence was not indifference. It was a space he could enter when he wished. He finally spoke. "There's a woman. A name, perhaps false, Delpierre. Perfume, good gloves, fine manners, connected somehow to the girl from Montparnasse." "She's alive, then?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Alive, dead, vanished. It makes little difference until I know why." He broke the bread absently, crumbs scattering across the tablecloth. "Everything circles back to that boarding house. The boy who vanished, the mother who lies too quickly, the letter written in calm handwriting, and now this woman who smells of violets." Madame Maigret poured more tea, her movements quiet, unhurried. "Do you think the boy and the woman are linked?" "I think everyone in this affair is linked, even those who don't know it. Paris is a web. You touch one thread, another trembles 3 streets away." She set down the teapot, folding her hands neatly. "Perhaps she's protecting him," she said. The boy. "Women often protect men they shouldn't." Maigret smiled wearily. and men often believe they can protect women who are beyond their reach. Like that clerk from Dijon, Villon. Honest, frightened, and still trying to make sense of someone else's silence. He rose and wandered to the window. The glass was fogged again, blurring the street below into soft patches of grey and yellow. Somewhere down there, a newspaper boy was shouting the morning headlines, but the words came muffled, as if underwater. "I keep thinking of the rain," he said. "It's been falling since she disappeared, as if Paris itself were trying to wash her away." Madame Maigret came to stand beside him. "You always notice the weather when something troubles you." "It's not the weather," he said quietly. "It's the silence that comes after it, when the city pauses between drops." She looked at him for a moment. "Then listen closely. That's when people speak without words." Her tone carried no instruction, only understanding. He turned to her with a tired affection, the kind born of decades spent sharing space, time, and the unspoken knowledge that his world of shadows could not exist without her light. At 9, he left the apartment, coat collar raised, pipe in hand. The damp streets gleamed like black ribbons leading nowhere in particular. He took the tram toward Rue Royale, the place of the perfumery. Inside, the shop was warm, almost too bright, its shelves lined with crystal bottles that caught the light like captured rain. A young woman approached, smiling the trained smile of salesgirls who serve clients they'll never meet twice. "Monsieur?" Maigret placed his hat on the counter and drew the folded handkerchief from his pocket, the one that had been wrapped around the girl's scarf. "This scent," he said. The woman lifted it delicately, inhaled and nodded. "Yes, Fleur de Paris. It's our most expensive fragrance, not sold anywhere else." "Do you keep records of your clients?" She blinked. "Sometimes, for deliveries." "I'd like to see them." His tone was mild, courteous, but final. Within moments, the manager appeared, a thin man with rimless spectacles and the air of someone who preferred order to conversation. He examined Maigret's badge, frowned slightly, then led him to a small office behind the counter. The record book was immaculate, names written in elegant loops, addresses spread across the city, the 7th arrondissement, Neuilly, Saint-Cloud, the sort of women who dined late and never took trams. Maigret turned the pages slowly until one name caught his eye. Delpierre, Hélène, 3, Rue du Pré-aux-Clercs. Purchases every 2 weeks, payment in cash. He closed the book. "You've been most helpful." By noon, he was standing in front of the building on Rue du Pré-aux-Clercs. It was quiet, discreet, the shutters freshly painted. The concierge, a plump woman in a dark shawl, answered his questions with the professional blandness of those who live among secrets. "Madame Delpierre? Yes, she's been here 6 months, alone, polite, pays promptly." "Visitors?" "Rarely. A man sometimes, middle-aged, distinguished, leaves before midnight." Maigret lit his pipe, letting the smoke curl lazily between them. "And last week?" The concierge frowned. "Last week? No, she left suddenly. 2 nights ago, maybe 3. Said she'd be gone for a few days." "Did she say where?" "No, she took only a small bag, but she seemed nervous." Maigret thanked her, then stood outside for a moment, watching the building's windows. The curtains were drawn tight, the kind of silence that spoke of deliberate absence. Someone had warned her. By evening he was back home. Madame Maigret had set the table again, her calm presence wrapping the room in warmth. As he ate, he told her only fragments, the name, the empty apartment, the vanished perfume. "She knew you were coming," Madame Maigret said gently. "Yes." "Then she's part of it." "She's at the center," he said, "and the rain keeps falling around her." After dinner, he sat by the fire while she poured tea. The flames reflected softly on the glass of the framed photographs. Family, long gone. Holidays, long past. For a moment, the room felt suspended outside time, untouched by the wet chill that haunted the rest of Paris. She handed him his cup, the china warm against his fingers. "You look tired." "I'm thinking of the boy," he said. "Armand. He's young enough to believe in escape, old enough to realize it doesn't exist. If he's with her, he'll stay until she tells him to go, and when she does, he'll never recover." Madame Maigret reached across the table, placing her hand lightly on his. "Then find her before she breaks him." He nodded slowly. The simplicity of her words steadied him. She never offered theories, only truths. That was why he trusted her more than any witness. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking time with the patience of old things. Outside, the rain began again, tapping the window like an invitation. Maigret leaned back, pipe smoke mingling with the scent of tea and damp wool. Somewhere across the city, Hélène Delpierre was closing another suitcase, perhaps watching the same rain through a different pane of glass. The pattern was tightening, thread by thread. The girl, the boy, the woman, the man with the grey hat, all moving under the same rain, bound by something that had begun long before the letter on the café table. When he finally rose, it was with the calm of a man who knows that every mystery eventually returns home. He kissed his wife's forehead, put on his hat, and said quietly, "It's time I asked the rain what it's hiding." She smiled faintly as though she understood. "Don't catch cold," she said, pouring him one last cup before he vanished into the mist. The Gare de Lyon loomed like a damp cathedral when Maigret arrived the next morning. Steam rose from the locomotives in white plumes that merged with the fog. Iron wheels screeched softly against wet rails, and the hollow call of a porter echoed under the high glass roof. The inspector moved through the bustle with his usual unhurried gait, hat low, coat heavy, pipe clenched between his teeth. His presence seemed to draw a subtle wake in the crowd, not because anyone recognized him, but because he carried silence around him like an aura. He had come not for trains, but for ghosts. Somewhere beneath this canopy of steel and soot, the vanished boy Armand had spent his night serving coffee to travelers who never looked up. Somewhere near, the girl who called herself Vera had waited for the same trains that carried her secrets north and south. And somewhere else, though perhaps closer than anyone knew, someone was still watching. The station cafe was nearly empty when he entered. The girl behind the counter gave him a tired smile, remembering him from the other evening. "Still looking for your friend, Inspector?" she asked. "For the moment," he said. "I'm looking for her shadow." She blinked, uncertain, and turned away to polish a glass that didn't need polishing. He took a seat by the back wall, where he could watch both the door and the clock above the beat counter. The minute hand trembled toward 9. He waited, sipping lukewarm coffee, until the man he'd asked Janvier to follow appeared, a stout fellow in a porter's uniform, shoulders hunched against the drizzle. "Dupin," Maigret greeted him quietly. "You worked with Armand Ravo?" "Yes, Inspector. Good lad, quick, polite. Too polite, maybe. The kind who says, 'Thank you,' even when you've stepped on his foot." "When did you see him last?" 2 nights ago. He left early. Said he'd been called to help his mother." "Did that strike you as strange?" Dupin hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "It did. He looked frightened. Not the kind of fear you get from a scolding, something else." "What kind of something?" The man shrugged helplessly. like he'd seen a ghost or knew one was waiting. Maigret studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you. That's all for now." When Dupin left, Maigret remained seated for a long while. The rhythm of the station filled the silence, the hiss of engines, the murmur of porters, the soft shuffle of departures. He imagined the boy leaving the café that night, glancing once over his shoulder, the rain already soaking through his thin coat. And someone, perhaps the woman called Delpierre, perhaps another, following just far enough behind to remain unseen. By noon, he was back at the boarding house. The rain had begun again, fine but steady, drumming on the zinc roof and trickling down the narrow gutters. Madame Ravoux opened the door before he could knock, her expression taut, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Inspector," she said, clutching her apron. "You've come about my boy?" "Yes." He stepped inside. "You said he was away working longer hours. That was not true." She swallowed hard. "No." "Then tell me what is." She led him to the small kitchen at the back of the house. The air smelled of cabbage soup and damp wood. She sat down heavily, wringing her hands in her lap. "He's gone," she whispered. "2 nights ago, after the lady came." "The lady?" "Hélène Delpierre. She's been here before, though I pretended not to notice. She'd visit late, always when I'd gone upstairs. Armand told me she was just a friend, but I'm not a fool. The last time she came with a car waiting outside, black, with the curtains drawn. They argued. I heard her say, 'It's done. There's no going back.' Then they left together." Maigret leaned back slightly. "And you didn't go after them?" Madame Ravoux gave a helpless gesture. "How could I? He was my son, yes, but she was different. The kind of woman who doesn't need to shout to make people obey." He watched her carefully. "Did you ever see her before your son knew her?" She hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Once, a year ago, maybe more, she came asking about a young woman, a lodger, who had stayed briefly, the same one you're asking about now, the one who called herself Vera." "And what did you tell her?" "Only that the girl had gone, that she'd left no address." "What did the woman say?" "Nothing. She smiled a little as if she'd expected it. Then she gave me money for the trouble and left." Maigret drew in smoke slowly, eyes half closed. The pattern was taking shape now. The missing girl, the woman with perfume and power, the boy drawn into their orbit. But he still didn't know what tied them together. "May I see Armand's room?" he asked. She nodded, rising stiffly, and led him upstairs. The attic was small, slanted under the roof, with one grimy window facing the railway yard. The bed was unmade, the sheets still bearing the shape of a restless body. A few shirts hung from a nail on the wall, and on the table stood a half-burned candle beside a stack of old newspapers. Maigret examined the room with care, touching nothing at first. The air felt stale, as though it had been sealed for days. Then, kneeling by the table, he noticed something caught between the pages of a paper. A small envelope, unaddressed. Inside were 2 folded letters. The first was brief, written in a woman's hand, the same precise, deliberate script as the letter found in the café. "Do not wait for me. They know. If I'm gone, keep what I left safe until he asks. Burn this afterward." The second was older, more personal, perhaps from before everything had gone wrong. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "You said once that people vanish because the world refuses to see them. If that happens to me, promise you'll remember I tried to tell the truth." It was signed simply. V. Maigret folded both letters carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. When he turned, Madame Ravoux was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Inspector," she whispered. "You won't harm him, will you, my boy?" He shook his head. No, but someone might if we don't find him first. Downstairs, before leaving, he paused at the coat rack. A man's umbrella leaned there, fine black silk with a carved ivory handle. He glanced at Madame Ravoux. Yours? She hesitated. No, it was hers. She left it here that night. He took it, studied the initials engraved faintly on the handle, HD, then replaced it gently. Keep it safe, he said. I may need it later. Outside, the rain came harder now, flattening the sound of the street into a low hum. He stood under the eaves, lighting his pipe. From somewhere behind him came the faint whistle of a departing train, long and mournful. He imagined the boy on one of those carriages, eyes darting to every platform, unsure if he was running away or being led. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were glowing through the fog. Lucas met him at the door with a note. "From Dijon," he said. "Urgent." Maigret unfolded it. The message was short. A man resembling your description of the traveller Borel was
found dead near the riverbank this morning. No papers, no wallet. He exhaled slowly, the smoke rising and vanishing like a sigh. The river had claimed another secret, but this one, he felt, would not stay buried for long. He turned to Lucas, eyes sharp again. "Prepare the car. We're going to Dijon." And as the rain thickened against the windows, Maigret knew that the road ahead would lead not to the end of the mystery, but deeper into its heart, to the place where all their lies began. The road to Dijon lay beneath a sky of unbroken grey, a sky that seemed to press low enough to touch. The countryside rolled past in shades of wet green and brown, fields glistening under rain, church spires dissolving into mist, villages huddled like forgotten thoughts. Maigret sat beside the driver, pipe unlit, eyes on the windshield where droplets chased each other in restless lines. He had not spoken since leaving Paris. Lucas drove in silence, respectful of that inward gravity his chief carried whenever the case began to cross from instinct into understanding. By the time they reached the outskirts of Dijon, the rain had gentled into a fine drizzle. The town wore its melancholy gracefully. Narrow streets washed clean, shutters closed against the damp, and the faint scent of wet stone that seemed older than the houses themselves. They stopped first at the police prefecture, where a young lieutenant awaited them with the alert unease of one who has spent the morning rehearsing his answers. "The body was found near the canal, Inspector," he said, leading them through the echoing corridor. "Middle-aged, well-dressed. No papers, but the tailor's mark on his coat is Parisian. Head wound, blunt object, no sign of robbery. Whoever did it wanted to erase, not steal." In the morgue, the light was pale and unforgiving. The dead man lay on a marble slab, his features half obscured by the stillness that comes after violence. Maigret studied him quietly. The grey hat hung on a hook beside the door. "That's him," Maigret murmured. "Borel, the commercial traveller from the boarding house." Lucas frowned. "Why kill him here?" "Because Dijon is where it began," Maigret said. The lieutenant blinked. "Began, Inspector." Maigret didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the body, studying the hands. Neat, uncalloused, not the hands of a man who handled goods or samples. "You see this, Lucas? No ink stains, no soil, no signs of labour. Our traveller travelled in name only." He straightened. "Tell your men to search the station ledgers. Find out when he arrived and who he met. He was not here by chance." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a thin film of mist that blurred the cobblestones. Maigret walked without speaking, pipe still unlit, until they reached a small square lined with chestnut trees. A café stood on the corner, one of those provincial places where time moves slower than thought. They took a table,
Near the window, and the waiter, recognizing the authority of their coats and silence, brought coffee without being asked. "This town hides its truths carefully," Maigret said at last. "When the girl used the name Vera Lemoine, she borrowed it from here. She must have known someone who once bore it truthfully." Lucas looked up. "A family?" "Perhaps. Or a name left lying around waiting for use. Either way, Dijon will remember it, if we ask the right people." They began with the registry office, where dust lay thick as a second skin over the shelves. The clerk, an old man with spectacles so smudged they seemed opaque, traced the index with a trembling finger. "Vera Lemoine," he murmured. "Ah, yes. Born 1908. Father, Léon Lemoine. Mother, deceased. But the entry stops in 1927, marked disappeared from record." "Disappeared?" Maigret repeated. The clerk nodded. "No address, no marriage, no death. Simply ceased to exist." Back on the street, Maigret drew in the cool air deeply. So there was a real Vera Lemoine. Our girl borrowed more than a name. She borrowed a life that had already gone missing. They traced the address, given in the registry, to a modest townhouse near the canal. The door was opened by a woman in her 50s, face pale, eyes wary. She looked from Maigret's badge to his expression, and seemed to know before he spoke why he had come. "You're from Paris," she said quietly. "It's about her, isn't it?" "About who, madame?" "Vera," she said simply. The name lingered in the air like perfume. "She was my niece," the woman continued, ushering them inside. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and dust. "She left Dijon 7 years ago, said she was going to work in Paris at a dressmaker's. We never heard from her again. Her father died believing she'd married. He received a letter once, unsigned, but written in her hand, saying she was happy. I knew it was false." "Why?" Maigret asked. "Because happiness doesn't require explanation." The simplicity of the statement struck him more deeply than any confession. He asked about visitors, letters, friends. There were none. The girl had left quietly, deliberately, erasing herself like chalk from a slate. When he rose to go, the aunt touched his sleeve. "If you find her," she said, "tell her I kept her room just as she left it." They walked back toward the canal as the bells from Saint-Benin tolled 3. The air was heavy, though the rain had not returned. Maigret stopped on the bridge, leaning against the railing, watching the ripples spread where a barge had just passed. "Lucas," he said slowly, "there's a pattern here. A girl disappears in Dijon under her own name. Years later, another uses that same name in Paris and vanishes again. Between them stands a woman of means who visits both cities under false pretexts, and a man who calls himself a traveller but carries nothing to sell." "And the boy?" Lucas asked. "The boy is what keeps them human. The witness they forgot to erase." He tapped the ashes from his cold pipe and straightened. "We'll call on the telegraph office. Borel worked with someone there. A clerk who might remember faces better than names." The office stood near the station, a building of pale stone and green shutters. The chief clerk, a thin fellow with ink on his cuffs, recognized Borel's photograph at once. "Yes, he came here last week," he said. "Collected a packet left under the name Vera Lemoine. I remember because he seemed nervous. I asked for identification. He showed me a note with your girl's name on it, said he was her brother." "Did you believe him?" The man hesitated. "He paid me to." Maigret's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "Did he say who sent the packet?" "No, but it came from Paris, posted at the boulevard Saint-Germain office." "Did you open it?" "Of course not, Inspector." Maigret's gaze held him a moment longer than comfort allowed, then softened. "Good. You'd have regretted it." When they stepped outside again, the first drops of rain were falling, large, deliberate, like the beginning of a confession. The clouds had gathered thickly above the canal, and the reflection of the street lamps shivered in the water. Lucas looked up. So she sent something from Paris to Dijon. Something Borel collected and died for. Yes, Maigret said, and someone else wants it back. They drove to the small hotel where they'd taken room. In his window, Maigret stood, watching the rain blur the city into a watercolor of grey and gold. He could feel the story closing in now, the girl who became someone else, the woman who erased her, and the faint echo of truth still bouncing between the two cities, like a telegraph signal gone unanswered. He took the two letters from his coat pocket, the ones found in Armand's attic, and spread them on the desk. Under the lamplight, the ink shimmered faintly. The second one, the one signed only V, contained a faint indentation, a mark pressed through from another page once lying atop it. He tilted it toward the light, squinting. The ghost of a word appeared, Pré au clair. He smiled grimly. She was here before she vanished, and she told him where to find her. Lucas looked up. Then Hélène Delpierre and Vera Lemoine are one and the same, Maigret finished. He folded the letters and put out the lamp. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest again, steady and rhythmic, like footsteps returning to a door that had never truly been closed. By dawn the rain had ceased, but left the air heavy, as if the sky itself had forgotten to exhale. Maigret stood on the platform at Dijon, collar up, pipe already lit, eyes on the departing train that would carry him back toward Paris. Lucas, beside him, looked drawn but alert, his notebook filled with details that might soon prove useless or indispensable. No one ever knew which until the end. The inspector's expression revealed nothing. But behind the smoke and the stillness, his mind was fixed on one image, a grey hat glinting faintly under the gaslight, a man who moved like someone accustomed to being unseen. By the time they reached the Gare de Lyon, the city was stirring again. Maigret sent Lucas home to rest and walked alone through the early fog toward the river. The streets glistened from the night's rain, horses stamped against the cold, a milk cart rattled over cobblestones, leaving pale streaks on the wet stones. He walked without hurry, letting the familiar rhythm of Paris ground him again. The city's silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of rain, but of expectation. When he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, a note waited on his desk. It was unsigned, written in a neat, controlled hand. If you wish to understand, come alone tonight to the Jardin des Plantes. The man in the grey hat will be there. He read it twice, then folded it carefully into his pocket. The day passed in small motions. Reports were written, questions asked, wires sent to Dijon and back. A photograph arrived, Borel's corpse by the canal, the wound hidden beneath his hat. Another file brought news of Armand Ravot. He had been seen in Nevers, alone, frightened, boarding a southbound train, each piece fit together and yet refused to form a picture. By evening, Maigret was tired of walls. He left the office just as the lamps along the quay began to flicker to life. The river was swollen, reflecting the light in trembling ribbons. A wind had risen, carrying with it the scent of rain's return. He walked south toward the Jardin des Plantes, pipe unlit, the note heavy in his pocket. The garden gates stood open, though the hour was late. The trees dripped faintly from the morning's moisture, and the air smelled of wet leaves and iron railings. Somewhere in the distance, an animal stirred in its cage. The sound was soft but alive, like breathing in the dark. Near the aviary, beneath a gas lamp that flickered fitfully, he saw him, the man in the grey hat. He stood very still, gloved hands resting on a cane, coat buttoned high. When Maigret approached, the man turned, revealing a face that might once have been handsome, but had grown weary from the strain of maintaining control. "Inspector," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "You came alone. Good." "Names, monsieur," Maigret replied. "We start with names." The man smiled faintly. "Names are less important than roles, but if it comforts you, Delpierre will do. Maurice Delpierre." Maigret lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his features. "So the husband, not the woman?" A slight pause. "You've met Hélène, then?" "I've followed her shadow. It's a long one." Delpierre exhaled, his breath visible in the cooling air. "You think you understand, but you—"
"Don't! My wife is ill. Has been for years. Her mind wanders. There are things she does not remember doing." "Writing letters?" The man's gaze flickered almost imperceptibly. "What letters?" "The ones signed V, the ones that told others not to wait. She left them with a boy who vanished, and a man who ended up floating in the canal." Delpierre's gloved hand tightened on his cane. "You speak of Borel. That fool meddled where he shouldn't. I paid him to keep silent, not to chase ghosts." "And the boy?" "I've never seen him." "You've seen everything," Maigret said softly. "You've spent your life seeing and pretending not to. That's the kind of blindness only the rich can afford." Delpierre's face hardened. "Careful, Inspector. There are limits to what you can accuse without proof." "There are limits," Maigret agreed, "but not the ones you think." They stood in silence, the gas lamp sputtering between them. Somewhere a clock struck 9, the sound carrying faintly through the damp air. Delpierre was the first to speak. "Hélène wasn't always like this. Before Paris, before him." "Him, meaning Borel?" He shook his head. "No, another. Years ago in Dijon, a painter. Married. She fell in love. He did not. When it ended, she tried to start again, under her maiden name, Vera Lemoine. It was a kind of disguise, a way to begin anew. But the past doesn't forgive disguise. Someone recognized her, someone she'd trusted." "And you?" Maigret asked quietly. "I found her later, in Paris. I thought I could help her forget. Instead, she drew me into her illusions. The boy, Armand, was her charity case. She saw in him the face of the man she'd lost. She believed she could rewrite her life through him." "And Borel?" Delpierre's eyes went cold. "He blackmailed her. He knew her secret. The letters, the false name, the man in Dijon who died for her years ago. He demanded money. She paid at first. Then she refused. I handled the rest." "You killed him." A pause, the faintest tremor in the man's voice. "I protected her." The words hung in the air, heavy as the fog gathering among the trees. "Where is she now?" Maigret asked. Delpierre's gaze drifted past him, toward the darkened garden path. "Gone. She left 2 nights ago. Said she was going to the river. Said the rain would remember what she'd forgotten." He took a slow step back, adjusting his hat. "You see, Inspector, there's nothing left to find, only echoes." "Echoes can still testify," Maigret said. Delpierre smiled faintly, like a man indulging a child. "Not in court, not where I sit." Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the mist. For a moment, Maigret considered following, but something in the man's departure, the unhurried gait, the way the cane tapped softly against the path, told him that pursuit would be meaningless. The truth had
already retreated beyond reach, somewhere between madness and devotion. He remained there long after the sound of footsteps had faded, pipe gone cold, breath misting in the lamplight. The rain began again, soft and persistent, beading on his hat, running down his coat. It was not the kind of rain that erased, it was the kind that preserved, sealing everything beneath a thin sheen of memory. When he finally left the garden, the streets were nearly empty. A single taxi idled by the gate. He climbed in, giving the driver an address almost without thinking, the Rue du Pré-aux-Clercs. The building stood quiet as before. The concierge was asleep, the courtyard slick with rain. Maigret climbed the stairs, the boards creaking under his weight. The door to Hélène Delpierre's flat was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of perfume and damp paper. On the table lay a single letter, open and unfinished. "I am tired of being two women," it read. "One for the world and one for the river. Perhaps the rain can make me whole again." He stood there for a long time, reading the line until it blurred. Then, folding the paper gently, he slipped it into his pocket. When he stepped back into the corridor, the wind had found its way through the window, carrying with it the faintest echo of water striking stone. The Seine was rising again. The next morning broke colourless, as if the city had been drained of light. The Seine moved beneath a thin skin of mist, its surface grey and silent, its breath cold enough to numb the fingers of anyone foolish enough to linger by the parapet. Barges crawled slowly along the current, their lanterns dull glimmers in the fog. Somewhere upstream, a bell tolled, though the sound arrived too late, as though the air itself resisted it. Maigret had slept little. The letter he'd found in Hélène Delpierre's apartment lay folded on his desk, its ink still faintly scented with her perfume. He'd read it again before dawn, trying to imagine the woman who could write such words, half confession, half surrender. A woman tired of being divided between guilt and invention, between truth and the lie that had replaced it. Now she had vanished into the only thing vast enough to absorb her contradictions, the rain itself. By 8, he was standing on the Pont Marie, coat collar turned up, pipe clenched in his teeth. The wind came off the water in long, invisible waves. A gendarme was waiting there, a young man whose nervous salute betrayed inexperience. "They found it, Inspector," he said. "A room just down by the quay, belonged to her, rented under a false name." They walked together down a narrow stairway leading to the lower embankment. The stones were slick, dark with moisture. At the base stood a row of storage rooms built into the wall, low-ceilinged, iron-doored, meant once for river merchants. The lock on one had been broken cleanly. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of perfume that had clung stubbornly to the walls. There was no bed, only a chair and a table. On the table lay a heap of burned papers, their edges curling inward like dead leaves. In one corner stood a small suitcase, half open, filled with letters bound by a ribbon. He knelt, lifted the top one, and saw the same careful handwriting. V. He carried the suitcase to the table and sat down. The first letters were to no one, fragments of thoughts, half-formed apologies, pages without dates. "I keep dreaming of water. Sometimes it's calm, sometimes it carries faces. I wake up not knowing which I prefer." Another read, "They said he died in Dijon, but they didn't say how long he'd been dying before that." And another, short, written almost in haste, "If I walk into the river, it will not be to escape but to return." There was something else, a photograph, a younger Hélène, smiling faintly, standing beside a man with his hand on her shoulder. The man was unmistakable. Borel. The commercial traveller who wasn't. His face in the photo was unguarded, almost gentle. They had known each other before Paris, before the false names and the rain. lovers, perhaps, or accomplices. Maigret studied the image in silence, then laid it gently atop the others. He could sense her presence here still, the calm precision, the order beneath the despair. Nothing about this place felt hurried. It wasn't a hideout. It was a confession chamber. "Any sign of her?" he asked. The gendarme shook his head. "Not yet. The river's too high. They'll start dragging again when the current drops." Maigret nodded. "Leave it. The Seine gives up what it wants to." When the man had gone, Maigret stayed. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of the barges outside and the slow dripping from the ceiling. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke coil upward through the pale light that filtered in from the slit of a window. Each case had its own rhythm, its own weather. This one moved like water, slow, inexorable, impossible to hold. He opened the suitcase again, feeling beneath the stack of letters. His fingers touched something thin and metallic. He drew it out, a key, small and old-fashioned, tied to a tag that read Studio 4, Rue des Saules, Montmartre. Montmartre, the hill where artists, dreamers, and ghosts shared lodgings with pigeons and painters. A long way from the quay, but close to where all this began. He rose, coat heavy on his shoulders, and stepped back into the daylight. The fog had lifted slightly, enough for the outlines of the bridges to appear, grey skeletons in the pale air. As he walked along the quay, he imagined the woman leaving this very spot, closing the door gently behind her, the letter still wet on her desk, the decision already made. No drama, no despair, only the quiet certainty of an ending chosen long before. By midday he was in Montmartre. The Rue des Saules was narrow, cobbled, smelling of wine and damp plaster. Studio 4 belonged to an old building with paint peeling from its shutters and ivy crawling up the walls. The concierge was a man of few words. "Madame Delpierre?" Maigret asked. "She paid for the month," the man said, scratching his chin. "Came only at night, sometimes brought a boy with her. Once or twice a man, always left before morning." Described the man. "Grey hat, fine coat, quiet." Maigret nodded slowly. "And the boy?" "Dark hair, thin, nervous, looked too young to be in trouble, but old enough to know he was." Inside, the studio smelled faintly of turpentine and rain. Canvases leaned against the walls, unfinished portraits of women, none with faces completed. The brushstrokes were careful, almost tender, as though the painter had been afraid to finish them. A palette rested on a stool, colours dried into small, desolate islands. He touched the edge of one canvas, and his fingers came away grey with dust. On the table by the window, a small sketch lay under a pane of glass. It showed the river at night, seen from above, the lamps on the bridges rendered as faint halos of yellow. In the foreground stood a single figure, coat and hat drawn tight, watching the water. The handwriting beneath the sketch was small but legible. He waited too long to understand. It wasn't signed, but he knew whose words they were. He stood there for a long time, the smell of linseed and mildew heavy in the air. Outside, a bell rang somewhere, its echo bouncing down the hill. A woman laughed faintly in the street below, a sound so brief it seemed borrowed from another life. He turned back to the painting, studying the figure by the river, the tilt of the shoulders, the posture. It might have been anyone. But Maigret thought of the man in the grey hat, the cane, the steady voice that had called murder protection. He thought of the woman who had tried to become someone else, the boy who mistook pity for purpose, the clerk who mistook kindness for salvation. They were all there, hidden in the brushstrokes, each waiting for the rain to stop. He looked once more at the river in the painting. Its current moved toward darkness, its edges soft, as if already blurring into oblivion. When he stepped outside, the clouds were breaking at last. A thin beam of sunlight slid across the rooftops, hesitant but real. For the first time in days, Maigret felt the air shift, cleaner, emptier, as though the city had taken a long breath. He lit his pipe, the flame catching easily this time. As he exhaled, he said quietly to no one, "So that's where you were hiding, Hélène?" In a room that faced the river, waiting for it to remember you. He turned toward the steps that wound down from Montmartre, toward the flatlands of the city where duty waited. But as he descended, he carried with him the image of that painted river, endless and silent, moving always toward the sea. The storm returned at dusk, rolling in from the west like an uninvited witness. By the time Maigret crossed the Pont Neuf, the lamps were blurring again, halos trembling in the wind. The smell of the Seine rose damp and old from below, mingled with cold smoke and the faint sweetness of wet chestnuts. The city had folded itself inward, shutters closed, shopkeepers lowered their awnings, and only the sound of rain remained, a steady percussion that seemed to mark the rhythm of his thoughts. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the clerk looked up as he entered, surprised to see him back so late. "Inspector, the man's here," he said. "Delpierre. He came an hour ago, says he wishes to speak." Maigret nodded once, hung his coat on the rack, and brushed the rain from his hat. His pipe was cold, but he didn't relight it. He could already smell tobacco in the interrogation room, the kind that belonged to nervous hands, trying to appear calm. Maurice Delpierre sat by the small table, his hat resting neatly before him. His gloves lay beside it, fingers folded together like those of a penitent at prayer. His face was pale but composed. He had aged years in the space of a single night. "You came back," Maigret said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I was tired of walking," Delpierre replied, "and tired of lies." Maigret sat opposite him. The lamp between them threw a pool of yellow light that turned the rain streaking down the window into long, shimmering threads. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint tick of water dripping from the brim of Delpierre's hat. "She's gone," the man said finally. "You've guessed that already." Maigret's voice was gentle. "The river?" Delpierre nodded slowly. "She left a letter for me. Not that I deserved it. She wrote that she was going home, not to Dijon, not to me, but to the place where her name could no longer hurt anyone. She meant the river. She always said water was the only thing that forgave." Maigret watched him closely. "And you, monsieur? What is it you've come to confess?" For a long time, Delpierre said nothing. His fingers played absently with the gloves, turning them over and over. When he spoke, his voice had changed, quieter, almost tender. "It wasn't meant to happen. Borel came to the house that night. He threatened her, demanded more money. He said he'd tell everyone about Dijon, about the name, about the boy. She was terrified. She begged me not to let him destroy her again." "So you followed him?" Maigret said. "Yes. To the station. He took the night train to Dijon. I sat 2 carriages behind, watching him through the glass. When he stepped off, it was raining. The same steady rain that's been falling ever since. I walked with him along the canal. He didn't even know I was there until it was too late." Delpierre's eyes lifted for the first time, and in them Maigret saw no bravado, no denial, only a weariness too deep for remorse. "You struck him?" "With the cane, once. He fell. It was quick. The water took him before I decided what to do. I stood there a long time, listening. When the ripples stopped, I walked away. Maigret nodded. And the boy, Armand? I never harmed him. She made him promise to keep her letters. He didn't know what they meant. When she realized you were closing in, she sent him away, told him to disappear until she could call him back. She said he was her conscience, the part of her that hadn't lied. The inspector leaned back, pipe unlit between his fingers. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming softly against the window. Why come now, Delpierre? You could have stayed hidden behind your money and your silence. Delpierre smiled faintly. Because she's gone, and I have nothing left to protect. When I heard they'd found her room by the river, I knew. She always said the water would remember her better than any grave. He fell silent. The lamp hissed faintly. Somewhere beyond the closed door, a typewriter clacked in another office, its rhythm indifferent to tragedy. Maigret rose slowly, pacing to the window. Through the rippling glass he could see the river glinting below, swollen and restless under the bridge. He thought of the girl who had become Hélène Delpierre, of the perfume that lingered in rooms she'd long since left, of the letters that had crossed from city to city like ghosts seeking rest. When he turned back, Delpierre was watching him. "You loved her," Maigret said. The man's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, but not enough to save her from herself. And she loved the rain," Maigret murmured, "because it blurred the edges between who she was and who she wanted to be." Delpierre lowered his eyes. "You understand her better than I ever did." Maigret sighed. "No, I only listen longer than most." He walked to the desk, wrote a few lines in his notebook, then looked up. "You'll make your statement formally. I'll send word to Dijon. They'll want to confirm the body. After that—" He let the sentence trail off. "I know," Delpierre said. "It doesn't matter. The rest of my life ended the night she walked into the rain." Maigret nodded, gestured for the sergeant outside to take him. Delpierre stood, placed his hat carefully back on his head, and followed without resistance. His footsteps faded down the corridor, slow, deliberate, echoing like a metronome against the stone floor. When the door closed, Maigret remained motionless for a long time. The room still held the faint warmth of the man's presence and the lingering scent of damp wool. He finally lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly, its light catching the raindrops on the glass. Through the window, Paris stretched out in shadow. Barges moved along the dark water like silent memories. Somewhere, a church bell rang, marking an hour no one cared to know. He thought of Madame Maigret, waiting at home with the lamp burning low, a pot of tea still warm. Her patience, as endless as the rain. He imagined her calm voice when he would tell her that it was over, though nothing in such stories ever truly ended. He walked to the window, opened it a crack, and let the night air in. The rain brushed against his face like a hand that no longer asked questions. Below, the Seine flowed on, wide and indifferent, carrying with it the fragments of every story that had begun and ended under its gaze. The river never judged, never forgave. It simply remembered. Maigret stood there until his pipe went out, watching the water glint faintly beneath the lamps, listening to the slow, eternal rhythm of the rain. Then quietly he said to the night, as though speaking to her, "You were right, madame. The rain never stops. It only changes hands." And with that, he closed the window, hung his coat to dry, and let the silence of the Quai des Orfèvres reclaim the room.